Hello, I'm Stuart. I'm the course leader for geography at Huddersfield New College, and I'm going to introduce you to a sample of a typical A-level geography lesson. So today we're going to look at, briefly to start with, the topics we do as part of the A-level geography course. So on the human geography side, we have changing places, contemporary urban environments, and global systems and global governance. On the physical geography side, we look at water and carbon cycles, coastal systems and landscapes, and the topic I'm going to talk to you today about, which is hazards. So we're going to think about whether all extreme natural events are actually hazardous. And we're going to think about why people might respond differently to different kinds of natural hazards. So I'd like to look at each of these pictures and think, what actually is the risk here? So, a fairly major volcanic eruption, clearly a flood, a different type of volcanic eruption, a wildfire in California, and the aftermath, I think you can tell, of an earthquake. And you're probably thinking, well, which of these pictures show natural hazards? And the answer surely is all of them. But picture one, up here in the top right, is a volcano. It's a fairly major eruption, but it's happening on the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, about 1,000 miles away from where a significant number of people live. So actually, not much of a hazard. Picture two I showed you here is definitely a flood, but this flood is happening on the streets of Dhaka in Bangladesh, when every year they get monsoon flooding just like this. So is an event that happens every year, that people are expecting, in fact in some cases looking forward to, actually a natural hazard. Picture three, down here, the alternative volcanic eruption. This lava, normally considered perhaps a hazard, is moving at a speed of about 1 metre every hour. And these scientists here are nonchalantly standing in front of the lava flow, discussing its progress. Does that therefore make this picture show a hazard? On the left-hand side, you've got a wildfire in California. Now, potentially this is a hazard, of course, but where it is at the moment is, again, about 50 miles away from the nearest town. And the firefighters in California would leave this fire well alone. They wouldn't even try and put it out because it's not actually a hazard. If the fire spread to a town, it might be a different matter. The only one of these which really can be called a hazard is what's happened in the picture here. Which is an earthquake in a village in Peru. And clearly you've got a fairly extreme natural event. These are all extreme natural events here coinciding with vulnerable people. And that's what creates your hazard. So when natural events, however extreme they are, occur away from large centres of population, then you have an extreme natural event, but you don't really have a hazard. But put a vulnerable population together with a severe hazardous event, as you can see from the screen here, then that creates a hazard and potentially a disaster if the incident is serious enough. So we're going to move on to response and think about what makes an appropriate response. As you might imagine, people respond to hazards in different ways. So have a look at the picture here and think, is this response appropriate to the hazard? And some of you are thinking, well, yeah, they're defending their houses. That seems like a good thing to do. But look again, and you'll see the average age of the people here is probably somewhere above 60. They're defending their own houses. They seem to have been fairly well prepared. They've got sandbags and they've got barriers to prevent their houses, but perhaps they ought to be evacuating. It does depend on the weather forecast. It depends on what kind of flood they're expecting. But this might be a very brave response, but not a very suitable one. However, it might be, for this kind of event, a very suitable response. Is this an appropriate response? These are thousands of Americans taking to their vehicles on the freeway. Now, this was actually the response to Hurricane Katrina. And you're thinking, well, yeah, this might be an appropriate response to a natural event, but it does depend on whether you've got your own car. It does depend on the forecast, how big the hurricane's forecast to be. And thinking about the people in those individual vehicles, it's only a suitable response if those people have somewhere to go. Friends, family, a hotel room booked further inland. And it might be that that's not an appropriate response. Now, many thousands of Americans did take to their cars and their vehicles and escape New Orleans ahead of Hurricane Katrina. But quite a lot stayed behind. And these were the people who stayed behind, and they went to the football stadium, many tens, hundreds of people lost their lives in Hurricane Katrina on the day of the actual storm itself. About 1,600 people in total lost their lives. Most were poor, most had stayed behind. Why didn't they leave? Can you think of some reasons about why the poor in the centre of New Orleans didn't evacuate? Perhaps this is an appropriate response. This man here has decided to sit cross-legged on the floor and pray. You might not think it's a very rational response, but again, can you think of circumstances when it might be either the only thing to do, or it might be actually a suitable decision based on the hazard itself? The alternative, perhaps, is the response of certain Americans to Hurricane Katrina when it hit Florida. It made landfall in Florida first, and lots of Americans decided to ignore the evacuation order and stay. Some went in the sea and went surfing. Some held parties, hurricane parties, and this guy here decided to lean into the storm and shout at it. Is this an appropriate response? Can you think of why it might be appropriate, why it might not be appropriate? And again, these are responses to similar kinds of events. So people are different. People respond to hazards in different ways, and that's important for us as geographers to consider, because we need to think about preventing loss of life, giving appropriate warnings as part of the natural hazards topic. So thinking about how people respond to hazards is really important. So what are the factors that might determine people's decision making? Well, wealth is important. The Americans who left could afford their own vehicles. Most of those poor Americans who stayed behind didn't have their own transport and didn't have relatives inland and couldn't afford hotel rooms. It could be education. It could be that students of A-level geography decide to respond differently after a topic at New College. It might be people's jobs. If you are actively involved in tackling the natural hazard, obviously you're inclined to stay. But there might be other people who, through their occupation, either have to stay or choose to stay. Often people, owners of small businesses, decide to stay in a risky environment to protect their business. Sometimes religion and culture makes a big difference to how people respond as well. It might encourage people to pray or to respond differently to natural hazards when they occur. And your age, family and marital status might make a big difference as well. If you're a young adult in America facing Hurricane Katrina, you might think a beach party is a natural thing to do. If you have young children, you might think differently. Have you experienced that kind of natural hazard before? Many people in the south coast of America, in Florida in particular, will have had experience of hurricanes. They will probably know what their house can stand up to and whether they're safe inside their own property. Someone who's not experienced it before may respond very differently to someone who has been there. And everyone's personal, so the values, perceptions of a hazard, your own personality and expectations also can make a really big difference. So too does community preparedness, whether a community groups together to respond to a particular hazard. And this idea of risk sharing in geography is the term we use for whether you're insured or not. So if you have insurance against a storm, you're perhaps very happy to leave your house. If you haven't, you might want to stay and do what you can to protect it. And how you respond to hazards is going to depend a lot on whether you're insured against the financial impacts of it. So 2 questions at the end. Are all extreme natural events hazardous? The answer clearly is no. And why do people respond in different ways to the same natural hazards? And the answer there is that there are a lot of very different people in very different circumstances. And all their circumstances need to be taken into account when planning the response to natural hazards. So I hope you've enjoyed that short video about A-level geography. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see some of you at some point in the future.